I posted a video recently describing how Shabir refutes his own argument, and I called this Shabir's Markian theory and critiqued Shabir's opinion that he frequently expresses about the Christology progressing through the Gospels. And it occurred to me I'm kind of treating Shabir like Zakir Naik. David Wood makes fun of Zakir Naik for refuting himself, which he does quite frequently. And Shabir, when it comes to the Old Testament, is not much better. He's a small step above Zakir Naik, but it seems whenever the Old Testament comes up, Shabir's ignorance is on display more than ever. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, that's just the truth. There's a specific point in the debate with David Wood and Shabir on the topic of the resurrection that I want to analyze. And again, I want to show that Shabir refutes his own argument, but I want to bring up something that's pretty substantial that's happening in Acts chapter 2, which is the focus point of this particular point in the debate, that I think was missed on both sides. The context is Acts chapter 2, mainly verses 25 through 28. Peter's giving a sermon, and he quotes Psalm 16, 8 through 11. And then a tug-of-war ensues between David Wood and Shabir Ali on this Psalm 16 issue. I'm going to be very careful to try to say David Wood each time versus David, so that I don't confuse the psalmist David with David Wood. And so too many Davids in this video. We'll try to keep them separate. But a tug-of-war ensues between Shabir Ali and David Wood on the Psalm 16 issue. Shabir wants to take Psalm 16 to mean what his interpretation of Surah Nisa, Ayah 157 of the Quran states, which Shabir's interpretation is something like, Jesus didn't die, but he came close to death, and then he was taken up into heaven by God. And so if that's the reading that Shabir can force on Psalm 16, then that's the reading that, or that's the meaning that Peter is alluding to when he quotes Psalm 16. And so in that sense, Psalm 16 would be invoked by Peter, which would match what the Quran says, at least according to Shabir on this issue. So you would have this contiguous line of thinking from the Psalms through Acts to the Quran, which is the line of reasoning that Shabir is trying to propose. David Wood, on the other hand, makes the qualification of remez, which is it's an interpretive method for prophecy, and it goes something like the prophecy illuminates the future event, and the future event, when it happens, illuminates nuances in the prophecy. And so a prophecy doesn't have to occur detail for detail as it's prophesied to be a legitimate prophecy. There is some interpretive room. While I do acknowledge this, David Wood applies this to Psalm 16, saying that Psalm 16 doesn't actually have to say death for it to mean death. And so Peter then, with the qualification of remez, is using Psalm 16 in his sermon to say that Jesus actually died. So you have both sides, David Wood and Shabir, trying to use Psalm 16, or I should say, you have both sides portraying Peter as using Psalm 16 as a proof text. Shabir's side, it's a proof text that Jesus didn't die, but he came close to death. And on David Wood's side, it's a proof text with the qualification of remez that Jesus actually died. Now, Shabir tries to force his reading of Surah 4 in the Quran onto Psalm 16 at his own peril, because when he does this, he demonstrates, again, a lack of knowledge with the Old Testament and with David's worldview. And I'm going to pause at this point to take a drink because I have an extremely dry throat. So, with that being said, David would have had one of two options in mind writing Psalm 16. One option would be that you die and you go to the underworld, to the realm of the dead, to Sheol. The other option, and this would be expressed in Psalm 49, would be that you die and you go to the underworld, and hopefully God will rescue you from Sheol. He will rescue you from the grave and take you to himself. So this would basically be one of two options that could have been going through David's mind. What would not have been going through David's mind is that he would not die, which is what Shabir is trying to force onto the text. This is ignorant. There's no basis for this whatsoever. In the Old Testament, in the history of Jewish thought on concepts surrounding death and resurrection, or in David's view, in the Psalms, it's just not there. It's not an option for David. And so Shabir is trying to force an utterly inappropriate interpretation of the psalmist David's words in Psalm 16, that it just can't be. The text cannot sustain it, and David's worldview cannot sustain the reading that Shabir is trying to impose. So that's the first big problem. But the second big problem comes from this notion that Peter is using Psalm 16 as a proof text for anything related to Jesus' death. That's just not the case. Peter's not doing that. Why? For the very simple reason that Peter does not need a proof text for Jesus' death. And David Wood even notes at some point around the 1 hour, 5 minute point, or actually probably around the 1 hour and 20 minute point. That's when David says has his rebuttal to Shabir's perspective on Psalm 16. David Wood notes that Peter says outright that Jesus died twice, leading up to his quotation of Psalm 16. But Peter doesn't try to prove it, and that's not why Peter uses Psalm 16. Peter doesn't try to prove Jesus' death. He doesn't have to prove Jesus' death because everyone at the time, everyone listening to Peter's sermon knew that Jesus died. You don't need a proof text for something everyone knows is obvious. Likewise, Peter does not try to prove that Jesus was raised. He simply says, "We are all witnesses to the fact," in verse 32. Okay, so two things that Peter does not need to prove to his audience. One, Jesus died. Two, Jesus was raised. But in between these statements is Psalm 16. So why is Psalm 16 there? It is a proof text, but it's not a proof text for Jesus' death. And it's not a proof text for Jesus' resurrection. It's a proof text for something else. It's a theological bridge between Jesus' death and his resurrection. So what does Peter say? Peter says, "It was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. For David says concerning him, I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken." Incredible statement by Peter here. Absolutely incredible. Notice what he does. He uses the pronoun him. Okay, in the preceding verse, God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. We know who Peter is referring to. He's referring to Jesus and using the pronoun him. Then notice what he does. For David says concerning him, that is Jesus, I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, keeping David from being shaken. Who is David's Lord? It's Jesus. For David says concerning Jesus, I saw the Lord. Peter here is conflating Jesus with the God of Israel. Now, to make things a bit more convoluted, notice farther down in the psalm, for you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption. Who is you? Well, that's Yahweh. Who is the Holy One? Well, that's Jesus. But the pronoun you would appear to refer to the Lord. But we've already established that the Lord, in Peter's view, is Jesus. So who is who? According to Peter's interpretation of Psalm 16. Who is the God of Israel? Who is Jesus? Who is David's Lord? If you think I'm treating the text dishonestly, just look later in the chapter, and it's actually in verse 34, where it says, David did not ascend to heaven, and yet he says, and then the quotation comes from Psalm 110, verse 1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Who is the Lord? It's Yahweh. Who is my Lord? That is David's Lord. Who is David's Lord? Jesus. So my Lord is Jesus for David, according to Peter, and the Lord is Yahweh, and the Holy One is Jesus in Psalm 16, but the you is Yahweh, but David says concerning him, that is Jesus, I saw the Lord. Right? I'm presenting this purposefully rather confusing. I'm presenting this purposefully with the lines blurred because that's how it is in the text. And that's how it is in many texts throughout the Old Testament. Who brought Israel out of the land of Egypt? Was it Yahweh, or was it the mysterious angel of the Lord figure who had the name of Yahweh in him? Or was it Jesus? It depends on what text you read. Are you reading Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy? Are you reading Jude? These are the type of texts where multiple divine persons are presented and the lines between them are blurred. The distinction between them is blurred. Theologians have already been through these texts, right? This is texts like these are the source from which springs things like Trinitarian monotheism, because it's the only way to make sense of the text. Okay, so I tell you this because I want you to know what Peter is doing here is nothing new. It's been done for a long, long time. It was done in the Hebrew Bible, and the rabbis noticed this, and they came up with this concept of two Yahwehs. One in heaven, the invisible Yahweh, and then one that occasionally makes the appearance on earth. Now, they're still monotheists, but they're just trying to parse the texts, right? And the two powers in heaven, which is a book by Alan Siegel, the theology is a two powers theology, and the book is Two Powers in Heaven, again by Alan Siegel, and it traces this line of thinking throughout the history of Jewish theology. And it became a heresy in the 2nd century, and it became a heresy for the rabbis because it was a catalyst through which Jews were converting to Christianity. Because you have this mysterious second Yahweh, if I can put it that way, in the Old Testament. And there was much speculation in the Second Temple period. Who is this other divine figure? And then when Jesus appeared in 1st century Palestine and made divine claims and performed miracles and died and rose again, it was very easy for many Jews to say, oh, now I know who this second Yahweh was. It was Jesus. And so they convert to Christianity. And so the rabbis condemn this two powers theology as a heresy. Okay, so that's an interesting side note, but back to the text. Again, this is nothing new. Peter is blurring the lines between Jesus and blurring the lines between the God of Israel. In doing this, he's conflating the two. In doing this, he's putting Jesus on par with the God of Israel. It was impossible for death to keep its hold on him, for David says concerning him, again Jesus, I saw the Lord always before me, David's Lord, again Jesus, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Okay, so I've given some theological background. Now I want to say explicitly what the theological bridge is between Jesus' death, which Peter simply states, he does not need to prove it, and Jesus' being raised, which again, he simply states he does not need to prove it. He says everyone who is hearing his message was a witness to the fact, right? The theological bridge is this: Jesus was the Lord of David. David lived a long time before Peter in first century Palestine. And so if Jesus was David's Lord, he's been around for a while. Apparently, death is not an issue. And so it's impossible for death to keep its hold on him. Furthermore, David's God did not just pop into existence. David's Lord did not just pop into existence. David's Lord existed necessarily from eternity past. And so again, we expand the argument. If David's Lord is Jesus, and David's Lord existed from eternity past, and David's Lord existed when David was writing Psalm 16, and David's Lord existed as Jesus in first century Palestine, then apparently death is not a problem. Death is not a problem for Jesus, and so it was impossible for death to keep its hold on Jesus. So Peter states Jesus' death as a fact. He does not need a proof text for this, okay? Peter is not preaching to Shabir Ali. Peter is not preaching to Muslims. Peter is not preaching to the only group of people in the world who deny that Jesus died, based on one verse in the Quran, contrary to the mountain of evidence that states that Jesus did die by crucifixion outside of Jerusalem in first century Palestine under Pontius Pilate. Okay, every serious-minded scholar acknowledges this, except for Muslims, except for Shabir. Okay, that was not the crowd that Peter was preaching to. Peter was preaching to a crowd that acknowledged the fact of Jesus' death. He doesn't need to prove it. He doesn't prove the resurrection. He doesn't need to prove that Jesus was raised. He says we're all witnesses. He takes these two things for granted. What Peter needs is a theological bridge between the two. That's why he needs a proof text, and that's why he brings up Psalm 16. The Lord of David was Jesus. He's been around for a long time, and so death has no power over him. That's what Peter's doing with Psalm 16. The one thing that Shabir says that is correct here is it appears that the earliest proclamation of the Christians, okay, the earliest proclamation of the Christians, this is what he gets right, and that's it. Acts 2 is one of the earliest proclamations of the Christians, absolutely, but it does not say what Shabir wants it to say. It cannot say what Shabir wants it to say, and respectfully, it doesn't even say what David Wood says it says. Peter does not need a proof text. That's not what it's saying. It's saying something a lot bigger. Peter is putting Jesus on par with the God of Israel. He is purposefully blurring the lines between Jesus and Yahweh. He's blurring the lines between David's Lord and Yahweh. And so the earliest proclamation has nothing to do with Shabir's interpretation of Surah An-Nisa, Ayah 157 of the Quran. Nothing. The earliest proclamation has everything to do with putting Jesus on par with the God of Israel. And that's why Shabir's argument, again, is self-refuting. I almost said Zakir Naik, but it's Shabir this time. What is it with these Islamic apologists and their self-refuting arguments? I guess it makes them easy to debate. Anyway, thanks for watching.